Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guests, Dr. Raymond Moody and Lisa Smartt. And they're here to share with us the afterlife and the University of Heaven. Now, Dr. Moody coined the term near-death experience in his book, Life After Life. For half a century, Dr. Moody has researched some of life's greatest mysteries. As both a PhD in philosophy and MD, Dr. Moody has had a strong interest in how medical realities intersect with the affective realms of philosophy. In his multiple roles of author, professor, public speaker, and grief counselor, he has heard thousands of accounts of near-death, shared death, and after-death experiences. Lisa Smartt is a linguist, educator, and poet. She's the author of Words at the Threshold, What We Say When We're Nearing Death. We had her on the show about a year ago to talk about this book, and it is absolutely amazing. The book is based on Data Collect Through Final Words Project, which is an ongoing study devoted to gathering and interpreting the mysterious language at end of life. She has worked closely with Dr. Raymond Moody, guided by his research into language, particularly unintelligible speech. So let's welcome to the show Dr. Raymond Moody and Lisa Smartt.
Thank you so much for having us on today.
What a deep honor it is to have the both of you here. My goodness, Lisa, we had you on, a couple years ago to talk about your book and how heartwarming that is. And to have Dr. Moody here, I'm so excited. So, I have to ask, how did the two of you start working together?
Wow. Do you want? Yeah, go ahead, Raymond.
Well, although I'm kind of known for my near-death work and the Life After Life book, as I said in Life After Life, my background was I'm a philosophy professor, and before I went to medical school, and I'm interested in logic and philosophy of language, and so really what was in the background of my writing of Life After Life was my interest in language, because as I said at the very beginning, what we're really dealing here with is narratives. I mean, you can't observe the actual experience. So what you have to study is the narratives that people give you. And I mean, I think language is really essential, and you can't really think about these near-death experiences unless you take that into account. So I have been interested since I was literally a kid in nonsense, in the sense of Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and so on. And, people with near-death experiences, the most common thing they tell you is that no matter how articulate they might be, they say you just can't put it into words. So I've been very interested in the last communications of people as they pass away often sound nonsensical to us. And if you ask the relatives who are left behind, they say, yeah, just before he died or the last few weeks of her life, she was talking nonsense, and yet the people were very moved by it. Like somewhere in the back of my mind is one philosopher, as professor of religious studies, told me whose husband had died, and the last few days he was talking nonsense, and she was very impressed by this because she felt that it had a sort of meaning. So I was talking about this some years ago, and up bounced my friend Lisa, who had been observing that very phenomenon in her father, who had died a little while before. And so that's what got us together. But I think there's just a natural kind of camaraderie here that we've always felt.
Well, for me, I had a background in linguistics, and I never imagined I would be working with Dr. Raymond Moody. I knew his book. Obviously, it came out when I was 17. It was a sensation in my community of people. But what happened is when I heard my father's language shift especially the last 3 weeks of his life, I was really intrigued by what I heard. And just synchronistically, my mother had a friend who was teaching a workshop with Raymond in Alabama. And I thought, well, what the heck? Let me see what this man knows about final words, because I heard things from my father that intrigued me profoundly, and I couldn't find answers to some of the questions I had about what I heard from my dad in those final weeks. And as a linguist, I noticed very specific changes in the language. So I went to this workshop, and there he was, talking about his interest in narrative and how difficult it is to speak about some of these experiences people have as they cross the threshold or after they've crossed the threshold. And so the moment I heard that he had that interest, I thought, oh my God, what an honor it would be to work with him and learn from him. And I've been fortunate to have done that in the last 6 years or so.
Yeah, let me say, this is what Lisa is doing. Which is something I had always been interested in, but there's only so many things you can study, if you know what I mean. I have a lot of things I'm working on, and that she came in and she's done this really phenomenal work, which she reports in her book, Words at the Threshold, where she is seeing the structures of the communications, the linguistic communications of people in their last few days and hours and minutes of life. And, this is just very important, because I am really confident that once we kind of see what the structure of that language is, that we will be able to sort of determine the point, ultimately, I think, where people in their dying process flip over to another state of existence. I think this work is, in my opinion, this is what's happening now in near-death studies.
Well, and it's on the leading edge of this frontier that you both are really kind of these travelers on, that you're taking us with you on this journey, which I'm so appreciative of, because there are things that are being said in those final moments. I've had a few friends pass over the last few years, and one talked about how her past dog was there with her, and and that she would be leaving soon. And it was very different in how she said that from all the rest of the time when she was going through the death process. So you hear these things and it has value.
Yes, there's in the Western world, the dog is the psychopomp animal. That is the animal that meets you when you die and takes you over. That's happened quite a number of times in my Psychomanteon project, where you take people through this process during which they seem to see and converse with relatives who've died, and had quite a number of cases of people who say that their dog appeared in that, which was a signal to them that this was safe. And it's also interesting to, being very compulsive, I have to say that in the Eastern world, like in Siberia and so on, the psychopomp animal is not the dog, but your horse, since that was a horse-based culture. And so it's, that period when we are crossing over to another world, it would make sense that we change, our language shifts. And that's what people with near-death experiences tell us, that there just are no words they can use to convey this. But I think that we are on the road now to cracking the code. I really do.
Well, there's so much there that we can learn and gain from your combined experiences on this topic. And, Dr. Moody, I'd like to ask you a very simple question. And then I've got one for Lisa right after that. So I know that you coined the term near-death experience. What was it that had you coin that term?
Well, because it was so obvious that there were so many of these experiences. I first heard about this not coming from a religious background. The idea of an afterlife, to me, I literally thought it was just a joke, that for something people had in cartoons. So I went to the University of Virginia and immediately fell in love with Plato. Literally, my first couple of days at UVA when I was 18 years old. And it was in reading Plato's Republic that I became aware that the Greek philosophers studied cases of people who were believed dead but revived, who told these stories. And I mean, I had a great interest in that. And then 3 years later, in 1965, I didn't understand that was still going on in the modern world. But in 1965, I heard the story of Dr. George Ritchie, who was a psychiatry professor at UVA, who had such an experience, and that got me fascinated with it. So by the time I went to medical school after a career as a philosophy professor, I went to medical school in 1972, and I already had a lot of these. So basically what happened, I was asked to give a lecture on my work in April of 1973, when I was in medical school, and I had to come up with some word. Well, what I was thinking was perimortal visionary experience, but my advisor, Russ Moores, who was my wonderful hematology professor, said, "No, Raymond, that's too medical." So I thought, and then if you say death experience, well, they weren't really dead, but we do say that people are near death. So I just said near-death experiences, and that's what stuck. Although I'll tell you the truth, I've always thought that's kind of an awkward-sounding experience, but it stuck. And now we know that in addition to near-death experiences, these experiences that take place when people are apparently dead but are revived, we know that identically the same experience takes place to people who are not themselves ill or injured, but who happen to be there at the death of someone else. So the bystanders in the shared death experiences, as we call them, talk about as their loved one dies, that they themselves get out of their body and go upward toward the light with their dying loved ones and so on, and then come back and rejoin their bodies. And all these things that we know of as near-death experiences also occur to bystanders. And that's why the communication of the dying in the last few days and hours and minutes of their lives is so important. It's we really have to hold on to this language and figure it out, because that's the only, people think they want a rational proof of an afterlife, and I'm beginning to think that may be possible in the future. But in the meantime, the way forward to that point is to have some sort of rational understanding of the dying words, because see, science as we have it is based on literal meaning, and you can't put the dying words of people into the context of literal meaning and make sense of it. So you've got to have a broader perspective on language.
And I love
and that's where Lisa, I think, her work is just very, very important.
Yeah, I think it's so important, the work that she's doing. And Lisa, from how this dovetails so nicely with this discussion, I know you have the Final Words Project. What have we learned so far about some of the final words? And is there any kind of patterns that are associated with them?
Yeah, there are several patterns. And as Raymond said, language shifts in ways that may indicate the pathway of consciousness. So we see language change, and we also see people's perceptions and experience change as they're crossing the threshold. So first of all, in terms of language, the language becomes much more metaphorical. So, the language of science aims to be objective. Everyone agrees upon this is a cup. And if we wanted to prove the cup, it would be replicable. We could all prove over and over again it's a cup. We all agree it's a cup. But we know in the realm of subjective experience, I might tell you that love is like a river. And you may tell me that love is like a rose. And Raymond might tell me that love is like a candy bar, right? So in terms of subjective experience.
Snickers specifically.
But we know that language expresses very different states of being, and literal experience is only one part of being human. And so what's so challenging as we look at the near-death experience and what people go through as the dying process is that you'll see the language starts to shift in ways that seem much more subjective. So one of the patterns we see, and this was also written about in the book Final Gifts. I just wanted to give them credit also for this. But people tend to announce some kind of big event, right? Some kind of big event is coming. So someone who is a golfer might announce the big golf tournament is coming. And someone who's a dancer may talk about the big dance that's approaching. And it's hard, people around may think, oh my God, they're going crazy. The meds, what are they talking about? There's no big golf game coming. But people begin to announce some kind of large event. My father started talking about the big art show. And oftentimes the metaphors people use to announce the big event are closely connected to their life narrative. So it's a very subjective filtering of their experience. So one gentleman said to his daughter, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe there are so many remodels. There are kitchens and dinettes to be remodeled." Well, he was a contractor, so what he was announcing to his daughter, he was going somewhere where there was a reality that was based on his subjective experience, his life narrative. So one of the patterns is that the language shifts and becomes much more metaphoric, and it also becomes nonsensical. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense. My father, for example, said to me, "Lisa, there's so much so in sorrow." That makes no sense. But as Raymond said, when my father said those words, even though it was technically nonsensical, my subjective experience of those words was very meaningful. It was as if he was saying, "This is a very sad time." Raymond, did you have something to chime in?
Yeah, I do. And the interesting thing about this too is that right now, people listening to us, I can guarantee you that a high percentage of the people who are listening to us are saying right on, because they have memories of this too. Once you bring it up in a big group, then lots of people start chiming in their memories of it. It's once somebody brings it to our attention, we can all see that, yeah, the dying words of people are very, very important. And so it's something that touches people very deeply when they start hearing that other people have been through the same thing.
And, I think what's so important is when we hear our children say things like there's a invisible rabbit, "Mommy, there's a rabbit over here," and we don't see the rabbit, right? Or whatever kind of what seems like imaginary, or whatever children say to us, we engage in an interaction. We don't discount their language. We don't discount their experience. And we know that that's really an important part of healthy development of kids. And in terms of the language at the threshold, all kinds of language appears. And one of the things I feel passionately about is to engage with that language and not be afraid of it or judge it, and to leave one's heart and mind open to the possibility that it is representative of something sacred happening rather than something scary. Because it can be scary when our loved ones start talking about things that sound different than we're used to. But on the other hand, for some people, it can be very comforting to listen closely. In the case of my dad, he was a complete skeptic. He didn't believe in anything beyond this world. So when he started talking to me about angels in the room, I was stunned, but also comforted by the language I heard as he was describing the angels that were around him, and have come to find out through the Final Words Project and other researchers also talk about this, that there are these takeaway figures that can be angels or people who have died before us, friends or family, who appear bedside often before we die. So not only is it the language we're looking at, but we're also looking at the experiences and the perceptions that people have that are expressed through their final words.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how some of that can be very small and we think about it later, or some can be very dramatic. I know when one of my friends passed, the nurse that was there said, and there's no way that this could have happened. The shades were drawn. There's no light source from that side of the house. But this big flash of bright light was in the room at the time that she passed. And so you get these different experiences that people have, and you just pay attention.
Yes. And light comes up commonly in the transcripts and the language. People talk about light a lot, which makes sense in so many ways when you look at the near-death experience, and just, for so many reasons. But absolutely. And I think part of my passion about this as a linguist and as a poet and as a daughter is, the more we can keep our, as I mentioned earlier, just be open to the possibility that the language can connect us to something really fascinating that's going on. And, there are other patterns. And one of the patterns that really struck me is something I call a sustained narrative, where someone might start talking about something 2 weeks before they die that on the surface looks like it makes no sense. So it might be something like, the train tracks aren't working, the train is broken. And then maybe a few days later, the tracks are repaired. And then if you track the language or follow the language, you'll see that suddenly there's a story that is evolving, this narrative. And then suddenly, before the person passes, they may say, okay, it's time to go. The train is leaving the station. And to me, it's amazing that when we're at a point where our brains are we're dying. So how is it we're holding these narratives over time in those final days or weeks, and telling these stories that if you track them over time, transcripts, they unfold in really remarkable ways. And so that's another pattern that really has caught my interest in terms of the consciousness.
One thing that sort of shows the importance of this is that there's a very profound conflict in common sense that holds us back from thinking rationally about some of the most important questions there is. And that is that the reality is that people love nonsense. I was reading in the New York Times a couple of years ago that worldwide, Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies. And you think of scat singing and doo-wop music from my childhood, where the nonsense is the form of nonsense syllables like sha-na-na-na-na-na, and that's counterbalanced with the meaningful parts like get a job. And so people love nonsense, but they cringe when they hear the word. And so what needs to happen is people need to acknowledge that nonsense is in a way, it's just as important a form of language as literal and figurative. And it's just that we don't see that, partly because we just don't like the word, which is so ridiculous. We love nonsense, but we don't like to hear that word. And so that's got to change. And once that changes, then we can really get into genuine rational investigation of the afterlife question. That is absolutely has to be done. And by the way, I'm having a book that will be on my life's work. It's entitled "Making Sense of Nonsense," and it's going to be published in Llewellyn by Llewellyn Publishers, I believe, in January is what they're looking forward to. So I'm really looking forward to that coming out, because really this is the big change we need to make to really get into the afterlife question as a serious question for rational investigation, is that we've got to see that nonsense is really okay. It's a great mode of language, and people in their dying days resort to this alternate mode of language as a way of trying to express what's going on with them. Nathaniel Hawthorne said one time, I know that what I'm saying is nonsense. He said, but these are the only words that seem to fit my feelings. And I know many people are all kinds of things. Like I've been thinking a lot lately about synesthesia, people with these cross sense perceptions, who say that when they hear sounds, they see colors along with the sounds, or vice versa, where somebody hears sees a color and they hear a sound that goes with it. And I was reading in a recent book on synesthesia about a little boy who would say things like, "That sound is red, isn't it?" And then first time he saw a rainbow, he said, "A song, a song, a song." Mm-hmm. And so nonsense can sometimes be a mode of language that people have to resort to express some of the most important things that go on with them.
And, I was trained as a linguist that there's no such thing as bad language. If it exists, it's like you can't say there's a bad tree or a bad leaf. So there's the idea that maybe English teachers teach prescriptive language, and that's where you say ain't is bad, right? That's prescriptive. But what linguists do, what Raymond's talking about, is a descriptive approach to language. And Raymond, I remember reading this very early on in Raymond's book that's now going to be published, Making Sense of Nonsense, when I read the manuscript. And what he said is, Chinese is completely unintelligible to you and me, right? Or it is to me, I should speak to myself. And however, it doesn't mean it's a bad language, and it also doesn't mean it's nonsensical, because once you understand the rules and once you understand it as a system, then it makes sense. And so one of the questions I have is, what kind of patterns of nonsense appear as people are dying? And there seem to be certain patterns. And in Raymond's book, he's identified many types of nonsense. And when we look at what patterns emerge and what kinds of effects do those patterns have psychologically or spiritually, these are really powerful questions. So when you get away from the idea that there's a right language and a wrong language, and just that there's language, and language is powerful, right? Language has the ability to set us into meditative states. My father was a psychologist, and he had such a grasp of language, he could hypnotize himself when he went to the dentist, so he didn't need Novocaine. So language is so powerful that we can create altered states, and my father was able to do it so that his gum was numb, so he didn't need Novocaine. So we know that language of all kinds is very powerful, and we shouldn't underestimate what it reveals to us about different dimensions, possibly, and certainly different states of mind.
Yes, it really has us kind of looking deeper into, not just how we perceive everything, but the world around us as well. My gosh, I could talk to you both for hours. Obviously, you're such great wealths of information, not just on this topic, but on many others. I'd love for you to share a little bit with us about the University of Heaven. What is that? And I know the two of you have been working on that.
Yes. Well, I had wanted for many years to have a forum where I could reach out to people who are seriously interested in these questions of life after death and near-death experiences. But I have no computer skills. My last computer, the crank broke off the side a couple of years ago. So Lisa is really great at that kind of stuff. So we've created this online forum called the universityofheaven.com, where we're conducting seminars with colleagues of ours, for example, medical doctors who've had profound near-death experiences mainly, or who have studied them, and we've had a lot of fun with it. And so you can reach us at the universityofheaven.com and learn all about our programs. We're finishing up one now where we actually show people how, if you wish, to call up the spirits of the dead. And I know this just sounds so bizarre, but in fact, the ancient Greeks had these institutions that were known as oracles of the dead, and they had various procedures you could go through where, in a fully awake state of consciousness, you would have experiences during which you seemed to see and converse with deceased loved ones. And to make a long story short, I had learned about this as a philosophy student, and just gradually over a long period of time and studying the archaeological reports on these places and combining that with my knowledge of as a medical doctor and psychiatrist of altered states of consciousness, we just sort of finally put all this together, and this works. I know it sounds bizarre, but my work on this has been replicated now by numerous different investigators. So we put together a whole program on how to do this, and it's step by step. And we have one of the people we interviewed on there. I took somebody through the procedure who had lost her son very tragically, and she talks about her experience during this process of seeing and conversing with her son. And, although it sounds extraordinary, this is something that was very well known in the West up until recent times. It was used as a grief therapy modality back in the Middle Ages and was very common, but sort of got put by the wayside. But we've called this back to the modern world, and it works. You really can go through a procedure. I'm a grief counseling is the main thing I do now. I mean, that's the last vestige of my clinical practices, that I do grief work with people. And this has now been taken up. One of the standard books of grief therapy tells you how to do this. And always I hear people say, if I only had 5 more minutes. Well, as counterintuitive it may seem, nonetheless, it is true that we have now a fairly reliable method for giving people that 5 more minutes.
Yeah, so I think the course, we're still working on it and putting it together, but should be released about the time that this broadcast, maybe a little later, about August 1st, we should have that. And we're getting ready to do the Near-Death Experience Summit with 13 different speakers. And again, by the time this broadcast, we'll have just the recorded version of it. But we have some great speakers, people who've had near-death experiences, and then researchers. And it's hosted by Trish Barker, who wrote a wonderful book called Angels in the OR, based on her near-death experience.
Yeah, Trish is amazing. And I see also, on the University of Heaven's website, you have noted researcher Dr. Kenneth Ring, who writes a monthly column. So there's so much great information for people to go to and really become more involved in educating themselves on this and on the language. So, well, where can our listeners, and Lisa, why don't you give the website one more time of where our listeners can go to connect with the both of you?
Great. A good start is the universityofheaven.com, and it's the universityofheaven.com. And then there's also the finalwordproject.org, where there's a lot of information about Raymond's nonsense work, as well as my work with Final Words.
Well, I can't wait to get my hands on the nonsense book. And when we do, we're going to have both of you on. So talk about
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne.
This actually makes it possible to, if you equip your mind with rational principles to enable you to understand nonsense language, then what this does, this can actually interact with near-death experiences. What I'm getting at here is we have a method now where we can prepare people with new rational principles, which help us out in this life too, because nonsense is a big factor in life. Very recent, everybody knows that commercial, right? Like, bada book, bada boom is the current one, but there are lots of those. And so normally nonsense just passes us by without us noticing it. But once you start noticing it and you realize that there are principles that govern nonsense, just as there are principles that govern literal language, then when subsequently you have a near-death experience, this gives you an entirely new way to articulate it. And this is the future, I think, of research into near-death experiences, that now we can actually prepare our minds ahead of time so that when we have such an experience, then we will be able to articulate it in a more intelligible and clear way for everybody else. This will partly overcome that difficulty people have, that no matter how articulate they are, they say that I just can't describe it to you. But now we have a way around that, and I've already had one case in which that has been shown, but more are to come. This will eventually sink in with people. It's already beginning to sink in with people.
Well, it's such useful information, because one day we're all going to cross that threshold, and to be able to have the language that will help us through that process, I think there's no price for that.
Yeah, I think that is right. That is right. It's because that's the main problem people have when they come back from this. They say, I just can't describe it to you. But now we have new ways of giving them the logical and linguistic means to formulate this and to talk about it in a way that brings it closer to the understanding of our common sense mentality. So.
Well, Lisa and Dr. Moody, I could talk for you both for hours. I mean, it's always such an honor to spend time with you, Lisa, and of course, Dr. Moody. I'm so and just love spending this time with you. Well, thank you so much for both being on the show with us here today.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you, Marianne.
Yes, thank you so much for this time, Marianne. I just really appreciate this.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moody and Lisa. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you, and of course, to talk about your work and the University of Heaven. Again, if you'd like to connect with both Lisa and Dr. Raymond, you can at theuniversityofheaven.com. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.